The sun beat down hard on the New Mexico dust, mean, unrelenting, and without apology. Mabel Dunn wiped her brow with the hem of her apron, her boots crunching over dry soil as she crossed the paddock. The well had been low all week, and the pump creaked like it had arthritis in its bones. She carried 2 buckets, one for the animals, the other for herself. But it didn't go that way, because as she rounded the corner of the barn, she saw him, half hidden in the brush, slumped against a fence post. Blood at his side, dirt caked in his dark hair, bare-chested, barely breathing, Apache. Even before he opened his eyes, she knew what he was. Even before she knelt beside him, she knew what this might cost her. But she poured the water anyway. First into his cupped hands, then to his lips. He didn't thank her, didn't speak, just drank. Watched her like she was more threat than mercy. And when she turned away to fetch a cloth, he was gone. But the next day his people came, on horseback, with paint on their faces and fire in their eyes. The first thing Mabel noticed was the silence. Not the kind that came from peace or distance, but the kind that settled over the land like a held breath. The chickens hadn't stirred. The wind had died completely. Even the insects seemed to be listening to something she couldn't hear. She stood on her porch with a chipped enamel cup in her hand, the coffee inside gone cold. It didn't matter. She wasn't drinking it. She was watching the horizon. The Apache had vanished the night before. She'd found him slumped near the fence line just past sundown, a mess of blood, sweat, and dust. He hadn't spoken, just looked at her, watched as she knelt beside him, checked the wound in his side, and poured water into his cupped hands. He drank, coughed once, then vanished when she turned her back to fetch a cloth. Now the wind smelled different. Mabel set the cup on the porch rail and stepped out into the yard. She didn't have to look long. There, at the edge of her eastern field, just where the land dipped into the gulch, figures moved. 4 riders, paint on their faces, shadows cutting across them like they were carved from smoke. She didn't run, didn't go for the rifle she kept under the bed, didn't even reach for the axe by the chopping block. She just stood. The riders came slowly, not like a threat, not exactly, but not like visitors either. She recognized the posture, military in its precision, measured, designed not to provoke but to remind. We see you. We know what you did. They stopped just outside the fence, where the dry earth cracked in wide, looping patterns. Dust clung to the hooves of their horses, which shifted only slightly beneath them. One rider dismounted. Mabel felt her stomach tighten. It was him, the same Apache who had bled beside her barn the day before. No longer weak, no longer hunched. Now upright, bare-chested, with a faded red sash tied around his waist and a rawhide pouch hanging from one shoulder. He stepped forward without speaking. In his hands, he carried something wrapped in a square of cloth. She didn't breathe until he stood on the other side of the fence, his eyes locked with hers. When he unwrapped the cloth, she saw it, her canteen, the one she'd filled pressed into his hands. The leather was still wet at the seams, but the water was gone. He held it out. She crossed the yard slowly, boots crunching the loose gravel, took the canteen without hesitation. I didn't ask for it back, she said. He didn't smile, but something in his face shifted. You gave it freely. I did, he nodded. Then we returned what was not ours to keep. For a long moment, they just looked at each other. You speak English, she said. Enough. Are they here to hurt me? No. Then why are they here? Because you touched a man who was supposed to die, he said, and now his life marks your land. She blinked. I didn't mean to mark anything. No one ever does. With that, he stepped back. One of the other riders leaned forward in his saddle and said something in Apache. The man nodded, replied briefly, then turned to Mabel again. They won't return, not unless you ask. I won't. He nodded once, then walked back to his horse. In seconds, the 4 riders disappeared over the hill. Mabel was alone again, but the land didn't feel empty. It felt watched. She turned, walked back to the porch, and sat down hard on the steps. The canteen lay across her knees, cool against the backs of her hands. She didn't know what she had done, but she had changed something. and it had changed her too. That night she barely slept. The shadows in the house felt longer, like the moonlight was stretching them farther than it used to. She lit a lantern and moved through the room slowly, checking the locks she already knew were latched, drawing curtains she never used to bother with. Outside, the wind returned. It whistled through the barn slats, knocked a loose shutter against the side of the bunkhouse. She sat by the window with a blanket around her shoulders and stared into the dark. The canteen sat on the table. Every time she looked away, she found her eyes drifting back to it, as if it might change. In the morning, she went about her work, fed the chickens, tended to the pump, checked the well, which was lower than it should have been. She kept moving, because movement meant she didn't have to stop and think. But even as she dug her hands into the soil of the garden, she kept glancing up toward the ridge. No one came. Not that day, not the next. On the third morning, she found footprints by the creek bed, barefoot, deep, fresh. They led away from the house toward the woods. She followed them for a mile before they vanished into stone. He hadn't returned, but he'd come close. That afternoon, she found a carved stone at the base of her porch, the size of her palm, smooth, with a single painted line across the center. Black, sharp, deliberate. She didn't know what it meant, but she placed it on the mantel, and she didn't touch it again. It had been 4 days since they came. 4 days since the Apache riders crested the ridge and vanished into the morning haze like they were never there. 4 days since Mabel found that carved stone on her porch. She hadn't moved it. It sat there still, untouched and unspoken, like a word she didn't yet know how to pronounce. But she felt it, like weight under her ribs, like something waiting. She didn't tell anyone. There was no one to tell. Not unless she rode to the next ranch and started talking. About warriors, about silence. About a man who bled and didn't say thank you. She didn't want to hear what people would say. They'd twist it, make it shameful. Or worse, make it nothing at all. So she let the days pass quietly, until the 6th day when she heard the knock, not at the door, on the wall of the barn, 3 times, even deliberate. She was inside the main house folding sheets when it came. She froze, hands buried in linen, and listened. The knock came again. By the time she stepped out the door, he was already walking away. The Apache, Tahoma. He didn't look back. He simply walked the edge of her field like he was tracing the line between 2 worlds, hers and his. She didn't call out, just watched. That night, she set out a bowl of bread and roasted beans on the porch rail. It was gone by morning. She told herself it might have been the foxes, but she left food again the next night, and the next. Each time it disappeared. On the 4th night, the bowl came back empty, washed, and beside it, a second stone. This one uncarved, just smoothed by time, pale as a cloud. She placed it beside the first. No questions asked, no answers needed. It was nearly a week before he spoke to her again. She was hauling feed sacks toward the barn when he appeared, just standing by the fence post like he'd grown from the wood. "You walk heavy," he said. She paused. "Excuse me?" "You carry your weight in your shoulders." "I've had to," she replied. "I know." She leaned against the sack and studied him. His hair was tied back. His hands were bare. He wore no war paint today, just dust, leather, and quiet. "I take it this isn't a social call," she said. "I came to see if you were afraid." "Of what?" He looked past her, to the horizon. "Of what happens next?" She nodded once, slowly. "I'm not afraid of you, if that's what you mean." His gaze returned to hers. "No," he said. "That's not what I meant." And then he turned and walked away. That night she couldn't sleep. She lit a lantern and sat by the fire, listening to the wind slip through the eaves. She didn't know what it meant, that he came, that he asked, but she felt the truth of it in her chest, like something old waking up. She remembered a time, long ago, when she still had her husband. When laughter came easy and sleep wasn't something she had to fight for. That life was gone now, burned up in fever and war. But sometimes the ghosts of it flickered around her. And lately, one of those ghosts had a living face. The next day he came again. This time, closer. He helped her mend the broken gatepost, saying nothing. Just handed her nails, held the beam steady while she pounded it in place. Afterwards, she offered him water. He took it, drank, and returned the cup without a word. "You don't say much," she remarked. "I wasn't taught your language with ease." "You say enough." His eyes met hers. "So do you." By the end of that week, he'd cleared the path behind her barn. Not with her permission, not with her protest. It just, happened. Each day she found something small change. A stack of wood cut and stacked. A broken hinge replaced. A rabbit left dressed and skinned, hanging on her back porch. And she let it happen. Because something inside her didn't want it to stop. One evening, he found her in the garden, trying to pull up a stubborn root. He knelt beside her, wordless, and dug with both hands. Together they pulled it free. It came loose suddenly, the two of them falling back in tandem, breathless. And then, for the first time, he laughed. It wasn't loud, but it was real. She stared at him, stunned. "I didn't think you laughed," she said. "You never gave me a reason before." "I still haven't." He nodded. "You stayed." That night they sat on the porch together. Not close, but not far either. The stars stretched wide above them, unblinking. She handed him a piece of bread. He broke it in half, passed one back. No one spoke, but they didn't have to. Because sometimes a man doesn't need to say thank you. Sometimes he just comes back. The rain came early that morning, quiet at first, tapping gently on the tin roof like it was asking permission to fall harder. Mabel stirred beneath the quilt and listened to the sound, breathing in the scent of damp earth that drifted in through the cracked window. It was the first real rain in over a month. By the time she was up and dressed, the yard had turned to mud, and by mid-morning, he was there. Tahoma. No horse this time. No leather straps. Just his boots, soaked through, and a look on his face that told her he hadn't come for work. He stood under the awning beside her porch, dripping but calm. "Something's changed," he said. Mabel leaned against the post, arms folded. "With me?" "Number with them." He looked out toward the tree line. She followed his gaze. "They don't want me here," she said plainly. "No," he replied. "They don't understand why you gave me water, or why I stayed." "Do you?" He turned his head slowly to her. "I do now." His voice was steady, but something behind it was fraying. She narrowed her eyes. "What aren't you saying?" "There's a meeting, elders. They want answers." "From me?" "From me. About you." "And what will you tell them?" He didn't answer. Instead, he stepped back into the rain and walked toward the barn. She found him later in the loft, sitting near the open hatch, watching the water trail down the roof slats. His coat lay beside him, heavy and wet. His shoulders were bare now, marked with old scars that curved like rivers down his back. She climbed up without a word and sat beside him. For a long time, they just listened to the storm. "You ever wonder why people do things for strangers?" he asked. "All the time." "And?" "I think we do it because we see something of ourselves in them." He nodded. "You saw me?" She thought about that. "You weren't dying," she said. "Not really, but something in you had given up." "And you?" "I hadn't gotten that far yet, but I was close." Silence followed. He turned to her, his voice lower now. "They'll ask me to prove where I stand." "You mean they'll want blood?" He didn't say yes, but he didn't say no. That night the wind rose with the rain, and the two fires in Mabel's stove crackled like they were trying to speak. She sat by the kitchen table, staring at the stone he'd left her days ago. The one with the painted line across it, a divide. She traced it with her finger. The door creaked open, and he entered, soaked again. But he didn't stop in the doorway this time. He crossed the room and sat across from her. "Tomorrow," he said, "they'll call me before them." "What do you want from me?" "I want to know if you'll still see me the same way when I come back." "And if you don't?" His jaw flexed. "Then you'll have seen me once, and that'll be enough." She looked him in the eye. "Come back." It wasn't a request, it was a vow. He stood, and then, finally, he touched her hand. Not for long, but with all the meaning words couldn't carry. In the morning, he was gone. The rain had stopped, but the ground remained soft, absorbing everything. She spent the day in silence, made bread she didn't eat, repaired the hem of a shirt that no longer fit her, sat by the window and watched the edge of the trees for signs of movement that never came. When dusk fell, she lit the lantern. When night came, she didn't put it out. When the clock passed midnight, she finally stood and opened the door. And there he was, on the porch, wet, tired, alive. She didn't speak. She didn't cry. She just stepped aside and let him in. He carried no weapons, but he was carrying something, a small pouch. He placed it on her table and sat. They asked if I'd taken something that didn't belong to us. And what did you say? I said you never belonged to anyone. He opened the pouch. Inside, another stone. This one with a circle, full, unbroken. I told them I would not forget the line between us, he said, but I would not fear it either. She picked up the stone and turned it over in her hand, and for the first time in years, she felt warmth that had nothing to do with fire. I don't want to be on either side anymore, she whispered. He looked at her like he'd been waiting to hear that his whole life. Then be between, he said, with me. And in that moment, between two fires, between two lives, between two pasts that never stopped burning, Mabel finally chose something that wasn't survival. She chose not to leave. The nights grew longer after that. The air cooled more quickly once the sun dropped behind the hills, and the wind carried with it the scent of mesquite and damp stone. Mabel found herself waiting for it each evening, its brush against her face as familiar now as breath. She and Tahoma had not spoken much about what had passed between them that night, but they didn't need to. He stayed. Not every night, not in the ways that might draw judgment from the world, but in all the ways that mattered. He fixed the chicken wire, mended the splintered fence by the west field, and once, without her asking, brought her a new axe handle carved smooth from cottonwood. She cooked a little more than usual. He ate every bite, left nothing behind. Some days he came with words, others only silence. But he always came. And she began to make space. One hook by the door now held his coat, one tin cup by the sink, turned upside down like hers. A second brush left by the basin, its bristles worn from dark hair. It wasn't a declaration, it was a pattern, a life beginning to fill in the blank edges. One afternoon she found him standing by the creek that had not run since last season. His hands were at his sides, eyes narrowed like he was listening to something the ground might one day say. "What are you thinking?" she asked from behind him. He turned, not startled. "This place was water once." "I was born near the cliffs past the canyon," he said. "My father died before I could ask him his name. My mother never stopped saying it. It still will be." "No," he said. "This exact place, this dirt, it carried rivers once, before fences had names." She stepped beside him. "I don't think I was made for fences." "I know," he said, then added, "That's why I came back." She didn't speak, but she stood closer than usual. He didn't move away. That night the moon rose full and the sky went silver. They sat on the porch as coyotes howled in the far distance, and for the first time, Tahoma told her something about his youth. Mabel listened. She called him Shadow Walker, said he could disappear even when the wind stayed still. Was he a warrior? "Not always," he said, "but once." She nodded. "And you?" "I've fought," he said, "but I've also run, from more things than I'll admit." "You don't seem like a man who runs." "I ran from silence. It always followed me. Until here." She looked at him then, really looked, saw the lines around his mouth, the wear behind his eyes. "I don't think you ran here," she said. "I think you stopped." The next day a rider came from the town, not someone Mabel knew well. A merchant's son, barely more than a boy, riding with urgency and a letter in his pocket. He didn't come up the path. He waited near the outer gate and called her name until she came down herself. "I was told to give this to the widow Dunn," he said, offering the envelope. "That's me." He hesitated, glanced over his shoulder at the hills. "Folks heard there's been Apache near here." "There's been people near here," she said. He swallowed. "Well, just, be careful, ma'am." She took the letter without a word and turned away. Inside, she didn't open it. She placed it on the shelf. And that night, when Tahoma came, she handed it to him. "I think it's about you," she said. He unfolded it carefully. read it in silence, then set it down beside the fire. They want me to return, to speak, to explain. Will you? He didn't answer right away. They ask if I've lost myself. Mabel leaned forward. Have you? He looked at her like she was the only steady thing left in the world. Number, I think. I've just begun to find what wasn't allowed to grow. She reached for his hand across the space between them, held it, warm, steady. You don't need to speak for them. You don't even need to speak for me. But if you stay silent, let it be your own quiet, not theirs. He nodded slowly, and for the first time, she saw the edge of something break behind his eyes. Gratitude. Real. Deep. Wordless. The next morning, she found a bundle left at her door, wrapped in deerskin, tied with sinew. Inside, a strip of cloth marked with red dye, a mark of bond, not ownership, not belonging, but alliance, a symbol that among his people, she would not be asked to explain her choices, not anymore. She wore it that day around her wrist, tied simply. When she rode into town to buy flour, no one said anything, but they looked, some with curiosity, some with suspicion. She met every gaze with a calm that only came from knowing something was hers and no one else's to name. Even the storekeep didn't ask what it meant. He only said, "We've got fresh peaches today," and she smiled. "Then I'll take 4. She left with her head high and her horse steady. Tahoma met her halfway home, waiting by the trail with a repaired saddlebag in his hand. "You ride well," he said. "I ride better now," she replied, and they finished the journey together, side by side. That night, they didn't say much. They didn't need to, because she had come to understand something simple. Some people live their whole lives trying to be remembered by name. But the lucky ones? They are remembered by where they stayed, and who they stayed beside. The first beam went up just after dawn. Tahoma had carved it the day before. Plain smooth, measured true, cedar cured and split by hand. He drove it into the ground with a long-handled mallet while Mabel held it steady, her palms pressed flat against the grain. They didn't speak while they worked. The morning light was too gold, too fragile, and the stillness between them felt more important than conversation. It had been Tahoma's idea to build something. Not a new barn, not a house, something smaller, personal. A structure that wouldn't be used for survival, but for meaning. A place for keeping things that don't need to be seen, he'd said. She had understood, because they both had them. Those quiet, invisible pieces of their lives that no one had ever asked about. Not really, and now with nothing chasing them but time, they were finally free to lay their own foundation. The frame rose slowly over the course of 3 days. No blueprints, no hammers, just handmade nails and borrowed tools, and Tahoma's memory of how things were built when words like property hadn't yet poisoned the soil. Mabel gathered stone from the creek bed. He carved signs into the lintel. Neither asked what the other was doing, but somehow it all fit. Each night they shared bread and tea by the porch. Tahoma never asked to stay. He just stayed. Sometimes on the porch bench, sometimes in the loft, once in the kitchen chair with his head resting on folded arms. And once, after a long day of lifting, sanding, hammering, they had both fallen asleep on the dirt floor of the half-finished shed, fireflies blinking between the beams like they were bearing witness to something holy. That was the night Mabel reached for his hand in the dark and didn't let go. The town didn't ask much anymore. A few riders passed by with longer glances than necessary. A child once asked Mabel if the man with the quiet voice lived at her place. She answered, "He lives where he chooses." That was enough. Still, there were those who remembered. A man at the feed store who muttered the word savage under his breath. A neighbor who stopped sending extra eggs. But Mabel didn't flinch. She had survived worse than a turn back, and the only people she needed to understand already did. On the 8th day of building, Tahoma returned from the hills with a strange expression. He carried a bundle in his hands, wrapped tightly in oilskin. "What is it?" she asked. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he brought it into the house, set it gently on the table, and unwrapped it like something sacred. Inside was a piece of wood, no longer than her forearm, carved with markings Mabel didn't recognize. Etched symbols, not letters, not English, Not Apache either, at least not any she'd seen before. It's old, he said. Older than this land even. Where did you find it? Buried, near the stones. I think someone hid it, someone who was afraid of forgetting. Mabel reached out, ran her fingers over the grooves. Is it a name? He nodded. Maybe not one you can speak, but one you can feel. She looked at him. Yours? Not just mine. Ours. She blinked. What do you mean? He placed her hand flat over the wood, then his own on top of hers. Sometimes we don't get to be remembered by name, he said, but we can be remembered by what we built and who we built it with. They stayed like that a long time, and for once Mabel didn't need anything explained. That night, thunder rolled low in the distance. The rain hadn't come yet, but the sky was restless, streaked with ash-colored clouds and heat that never touched the ground. Mabel stood on the edge of her porch, watching it all. Tahoma joined her, bare feet silent against the planks. You ever think about what comes next? She asked. He thought for a while. I used to. And now? Now I think about what comes with. She turned to him. What do you mean? I mean I've lived through enough endings. I want to learn what it means to stay through something beginning. Her throat tightened, and when the rain finally came, it was soft. Not a storm, not punishment. Just water, like forgiveness falling from the sky. In the days that followed, the structure was finished. No windows, one door, a roof that sloped low and wide. Inside, they placed no furniture, just the stone she'd kept from before, the canteen he'd returned, the carved wood with its nameless story, and a bundle of sage tied with red twine, which neither of them said anything about, but which both understood. They never named the place, but when either of them disappeared for a moment, the other knew where to look. Sometimes Tahoma would sit inside with his back to the wall and eyes closed. Sometimes Mabel would light a single candle and watch it burn all the way down. Not for ceremony, just because they had made something together, something that wasn't a barn or a grave or a house built on anyone else's rules, just a room where a life could rest. One morning, Mabel found a piece of cloth folded on the table. Inside, a set of moccasins, worn but sturdy, just her size, and on the toe of the left shoe, stitched in a faded thread, was a symbol that matched the carved wood inside their shelter. She slipped them on without speaking and walked out to meet the day. Not as a settler, not as a widow, not even as a woman who'd offered water to a dying man, but as someone who had stayed and chosen and helped build something no wind could carry away. The fire started far from her land. It began where the brush grew thick along the north ridge, fed by wind and old timber. No one saw it coming. No lightning, no spark. Just a red bloom on the horizon one dusk, like someone had opened the sky and poured blood across the mountains. By morning, the smoke had reached her porch. Not thick, not choking, just enough to taste on the back of the tongue. Enough to remind her that some things, no matter how well tended, will come for you eventually. Mabel didn't panic. She moved slowly, methodically. She filled every barrel with water, closed the barn, untied the mule and let it loose toward the dry creek bed, farther from the trees. She didn't ask where Tahoma was. She knew he'd come, and he did. An hour after the ash began to fall, he stepped out of the heat haze, boots black with soot, a slash of dirt across his cheekbone. You stayed, he said. Of course I did. We may need to leave. Mabel shook her head. Not unless the fire walks through the door. He looked at her a long time, then said, Then let's make sure it doesn't. They soaked the porch with buckets, dug a trench around the small outbuilding they'd built together, covered it with wet cloth, with blankets, with prayer. Not spoken aloud, but breathed, steady and deep, with every motion. Neighbors had left already. Those who lived on flatter land could move their stock and wagons. She saw distant plumes of dust to the west, caravans of caution. But Mabel had long ago decided she would not run again. Tahoma didn't argue. He simply stayed. By nightfall, the glow of the fire had drawn closer. No flames yet, just the slow, relentless light of something consuming what no longer resisted. They sat on the porch, both too tired to speak, And then she said softly, "I used to think this land wanted me gone." He didn't look away from the hills. "It never did." "No," she said. "I did. I wanted me gone." He turned to her. "You're not that woman anymore." She exhaled. "Number, I'm not." They didn't speak again until the first ember floated across the sky. The wind changed sometime after midnight, brought the fire down lower, faster, crackling, alive. The barn caught first, a shriek of heat and old pine. Mabel didn't try to save it. She stood with her arm around Tahoma's waist and watched it go. He held her shoulder. "Steady." Beside them, the outbuilding, the place they had made without a name, still stood. Blankets smoldered, smoke curled from the lintel, but it didn't catch. When the wind passed, when the fire turned and began to climb back toward the ridge, it was still there. So were they, covered in ash, eyes wide, hands clasped tight, alive. At dawn, the world was gray, sky, soil, breath. But the house had held, and so had they. They ate breakfast on the porch as if it were any other day. Toast burned, tea bitter. Mabel couldn't stop smiling. "I thought I would mourn the barn," she said, "but I don't. It served its time. So did that chapter of me." He looked at her. "You're ready?" "I think I've been ready a long time," she said. "I just needed to stand in something long enough to believe it wouldn't burn." She reached into her apron and withdrew the smooth stone he'd given her, the one with the full circle. "It didn't burn," she whispered. "No," he said. "It never could." She turned it in her palm. "Let's build something again." That spring, they did. A new barn, simpler, lower, and a second room added to the house where sunlight hit the floor just so in the mornings. They planted beans and sage and flowers Mabel couldn't name, but that bloomed anyway. Neighbors returned. Some brought nails, some brought words, and a few, just a few, brought respect. That was enough. Tahoma carved a new beam for the front porch, etched into it, not in English or Apache, but in the same ancient markings from the wooden tablet he'd once buried behind the outbuilding. Mabel never asked what it said. She didn't have to. She knew. One night, long after the new garden had taken root, Mabel sat with a book open in her lap and her feet bare against the cool floorboards. Tahoma sat across from her, threading arrow fletchings. They worked in silence for a long while. Then she said, "Do you think they'll remember us?" "Who?" "Anyone, after we're gone." He didn't answer immediately, then looked at her with the calm certainty she'd come to love. "They'll remember this place," he said. "The stone, the soil, the room with no name. And that'll be enough?" "That's more than most." She closed the book, crossed the room, sat beside him. He pressed his forehead to hers, and she whispered, "We were never meant to find each other," he replied, "and yet we did." Outside, the wind carried only petals now, and somewhere in the hills, the land that had once marked her for silence had given her something better. A name it couldn't take, a place it couldn't burn, and a love that didn't need to be spoken to be real. Some stories aren't written in ink, but in silence and soot, along fence posts, across fire lines, between the steady hands of two people who chose not to run. Mabel didn't ask to be brave. She just kept showing up. Tahoma didn't ask to be understood, but he stayed long enough to be known. Together, they didn't fight the world. They rebuilt one small part of it, with stone and bread and quiet mornings where nothing needed to be said. Maybe you've stood where Mabel stood, too tired to explain yourself, too proud to leave. Maybe you've waited like Tahoma did, for someone to see past the silence and stay anyway. Or maybe you're somewhere in between, like most of us. Either way, you know this. It isn't grand gestures that make us whole. It's the everyday choice to believe we're worth coming back for. So tell us, which moment in their journey stayed with you? Was it the water, the fire, the silence between two people who didn't have to speak to be heard? We'd love to hear what this story meant to you, and where in the world you're watching from, because stories like theirs, they only stay alive when someone chooses to remember.